Hi, my name is Alex, and today I'll be talking to Professor Isaacson. After graduating from Cambridge and working on hydrotechnical projects around the world, Dr. Isaacson joined UBC in 1976. Since then, he has gone on to serve in many high-profile roles, such as being the Dean of Applied Science and membership on UBC Vancouver's Senate. Now, Professor Isaacson spends his time teaching, professionally serving, independently consulting, and continuing his research on coastal and offshore hydrodynamics. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you for those kind words. I look forward to this meeting with you.
Thank you. So looking at your career, it's very impressive, it's very deep, and it's very broad. You've served across many organizations, many different roles, such as when you were an editor for the paper, the Canadian Engineering Newsletter, I believe.
Canadian Journal for Civil Engineering,
Yeah.
I think. Yeah, I was editor of that for some time, that's right.
So looking at your career, as a student, did you imagine it turning out the way it did?
In a sense, one step led to the other. I think I started off with my undergraduate degree, and that was at Cambridge. So it was a general engineering degree, not specialist in civil or any other branch of engineering. And then it sort of naturally flowed that I was particularly interested in fluids and research. So that led to the PhD, which in turn led to first a postdoc and then to a faculty position. So I've been at UBC for many, many years. And so in a sense, one thing led to the other. I suppose there was one potential fork in the road. After doing my PhD, do I go and work for a company on engineering projects, or do I stay in research? And in the end, I stayed in research and went on to a postdoc. So that's sort of the direction of my career.
Okay. And working for so many high-profile organizations, are there any memories or special events that you remember fondly?
Well, some slightly humorous ones. I'll mention two or three. One or two more humorous ones. So I finished my PhD in the UK at Cambridge. I worked for a company for a short while, and then I got a postdoc in Honolulu, Hawaii, which is sort of as different as you can get. Not only the sort of American lifestyle and culture, but also the tropics and everything else. So I went along to my first day on the job, and two things happened that surprised me. One is, of course, I don't know anybody there, so I go in a nice suit and tie and all the rest of it. And they were all in lower shirts and sandals and shorts. And I thought, oh my goodness, that's not the best first impression, but it worked out fine. And the other thing that happened is, I think it was that day or the next day, there were these alarms going on all around the city. And I thought, my goodness, must be a nuclear attack or something. It turns out it was a tsunami warning system that they test every month or two. And so that concerned me. So those were a couple of more sort of flippant events that I recall. But of course, beyond that, there have been many, many memorable events with many of my consulting assignments, or with some of the committees I've been on, or within UBC with my research, with my teaching, and so on. Maybe too many to go through, but there's a couple.
All right. So you mentioned consulting right there. So as an independent consultant, what's it like? What's your day-to-day life like when you're working on a project, and how does that affect you?
Well, don't forget, I'm full-time at UBC as a professor, and so this is always a part-time activity with basically on an hourly rate, like a few hours here and there, and doing it project by project. And that's ranged from relatively minor local projects, giving advice, to much more major international projects. I think the other distinction is being a professor, I'm a specialist, so I'm not signing the drawings and doing the entire project, but I'm pulled in for the more specialist advice. So one high profile project that I completed a few years ago, where my client, well, not strictly my client, but my client's client was the Oscar winner, Leonardo DiCaprio. And he bought a small island in Belize and was trying to develop it in an eco-friendly way. And so I had to go down to Belize and study the site and make predictions of sea level rise and hurricanes and storm surges and so on and so forth. So that was a lot of fun. But there are many other projects with major oil companies, going down to Houston with their modeling of oil rigs and on and on. So lots of fairly high profile ones like that.
Okay, that's really cool. So you said you're a specialist and you got that, or I guess you have that designation through your standing as a professor, so people recognize you as a specialist. For engineers that want to go into consulting, would you say that PhD is very, very important? Like, obviously you can probably do it without the PhD, but does that really set you apart from other people, would you say?
No, it's different. I call myself a specialist consultant, but most engineers, the vast majority, especially after you graduate, you become an EIT, you work for a major company, you get your PN, you carry on, you may change jobs and so on. Maybe over 5 years later or 10 years later, and then you might decide to set up your own company. And then if you do that, there's a whole bunch of issues and things to think about and plans to be made to do that. So that profile of being successful in, if you like, developing and running a company is very different to what I've done, which is more the specialist. And so you don't need a PhD to do this other more, this alternative path, career path that I just described.
Okay. So going on to career advice, is there anything that you see engineers doing in the workplace, like currently, that you think they shouldn't be doing or you believe they could change, should do better at their jobs?
Yeah. And I think I would sum it up. Well, there's several things, but I think the biggest one, and it sort of ties back to the course I teach, Civil 402, professionalism. Well, this course is professionalism in civil engineering, but that's true for engineering as a whole. And that is, engineers really need to have that front and center and think about that in most things they do. And it goes down to following the sort of requirements of a job and not going off on a tangent. It might be ethical type of issues. It might be personnel issues, how you interact with your client. And you know, all those sorts of, if you like, non-technical and behavioral type of traits that professional engineers need to follow. And to me, that's probably the single most important item to watch out for if you're going into the career, and if you're in the career at the earlier stages of a career, for sure.
Okay. Thank you for those insights. So if you could go back in time and talk to the 22-year-old self in school, still trying to figure out what he wants to do, what would you tell him? What advice would you offer?
Probably we talk about the academic career focus of people's interests, and that's absolutely right. And within academic career, there's what you might call the technical and the non-technical, as I sort of just described. So presumably you're going to be interested and accomplished in whether it's numerical modeling or analyzing structures or situations and all the rest of it on the one hand. On the other hand, there are all the non-technical attributes that you need to think about and focus in on, codes of ethics, people skills, interactions with people, and so on and so forth. So those, if you like, the two pieces on the academic side. But that's only part one. There's actually three parts. Part one is your academic work environment. Number two is your family life. Now, depends whether you're getting married, you've got young children, but typically family life is a big part of living, right? And so you've got to have a balance between, on the one hand, you've got your academic work life, you've got your family life with your kids, with your family, whoever it is, and how you shape that and how you contribute to that. And then the third part is, which is a little bit tied to both of those, is your overall life environment. Maybe it's which city you live, what hobbies you have, what are your values, whether it's political or sports or whatever, and how you balance that as well. So I like to think of it as almost three aspects of one's life and having a suitable balance between those. And of course, they do overlap to some degree. But that's sort of the way I try to think of it.
Okay, so for like finding that balance, what was your method for finding that balance and knowing how you wanted to allocate your time and what was important to you?
It's tempting to focus on work, or career, and you've got to sometimes discipline yourself to say no. The world's not going to collapse if I don't work this weekend, but I got to take the kids out on an outing or something like that. So sometimes you do need to remind yourself of that, and I have done that. But at the end of the day, I've been very pleased with my well-being and my comfort level, and I'm happy with the sort of balance I have achieved.
Glad to hear that. So, going back to your consulting experience, or I guess just work experience in general in the field and on projects, when you run into something you don't know what the answer is to, which I'm sure happens every now and then, what do you do to find the answer, especially when it's just you as a specialist working on the project?
You talking about the, if you like, the technical answers to a particular project that I'm trying to, well, that's sort of a bit different with me because, as I say, I'm a specialist consultant. And so I get pretty challenging problems. And it's a little bit different to, if you like, the more traditional engineers who might look up the codes and apply them, and everything is okay. But very often some of the problems I've had are not written down in the codes. You've got to maybe do an analysis, do some additional research, do reviews, of what people have been up to. I mean, one example, we had a major lawsuit a few years ago involving the expansion of the port of Anchorage in Alaska. And they were, so I was essentially like an expert witness or expert advisor on that. And they were worried about risks to do with earthquakes and tides and groundwater and all the rest of it. And there were no well-articulated codes. So we had to do some research and figure it out. So it's just perseverance and relying on one's experience of where to go and how to do the analysis and how to put it together. That was quite challenging, but it turned out to be very successful from my point of view.
Okay, it's very interesting. So when did you know that you were ready to start branching off and doing these specialized jobs where they would call you in to do them? Was there a point where you're like, I want to do this, or did it just naturally come?
So from my side, I was a young professor at UBC. And so when the first opportunities arose, I jumped on board and said, yes, let me go ahead and get involved. The first one many, many years ago was actually French Creek on Vancouver Island. just north of Parksville, where they were expanding the marina and putting in new breakwaters. So that was my first exposure to a real civil engineering project in BC, and working on that, and that was very good. But that's me. If you're looking for advice for a new graduate, it's probably going to be quite different, because as I said, they'll start off working for a large company and getting more and more project experience, and then maybe specializing a bit more in certain types of projects, or maybe going more into management. And you just seize these opportunities as they come along, and very often and invariably that's going to tie into your own personal interests.
Okay. So going back and looking back at your career, we all make mistakes. It happens to everybody. Is there any mistake that you've made that you've learned the most from and you think people can learn a lot from as well?
Yes. Fortunately, I haven't been in a position of making a mistake that's led to some major problem, A, with a project, and B, with my own sort of personal integrity and all the rest of it. But rather than just making mistakes, I think the key is to try and build in as many safeguards as possible. And the big one nowadays, and we see this in the newspapers a lot, is inadvertent, whether it's inadvertent emails, or you didn't say the right thing, you sent it off too quickly and you said, oh, I should have expressed it a bit differently. Or it might be a video that, you know, you see something, maybe a confidential document is showing or whatever it is. But it's, hey, that's not just me, and it's not just us in this environment. You read this on in the news, I think, all the time, where those kinds of mistakes happen more and more. So I think the key is to re-review or review things before you hit the send button or before you write the report. You've got to be meticulous, read it over again and again, make sure you've got it right. If there are issues around that, is you know, like I talk about in my courses, confidentiality and conflicts of interest. And some of those are not straightforward. They're pretty challenging. You're not quite sure who it's confidential, with respect to who it's confidential, or whom is it a conflict of interest or not. So it's learning from those issues and what we call continual improvement. So it's a long-winded answer that you can get close to making blatant mistakes, but you've got to put in safeguards to try and prevent those or limit those to the extent possible.
Okay, that's a very insightful look into that. So throughout your career, I'm sure you have met many people, you've worked with many people throughout many different types of organizations in different roles. So how do you advise young engineers just starting their career begin networking and opening up, opening up doors, so to say?
So I think one of them is going back to the valuable traits that I think young engineers need to keep front and foremost. I had a guest lecture in 402 recently, who's run a very successful company for many years. And the one word he uses is trustworthiness. And that's how he builds up his client base. I mean, apart from a bunch of other things, but your relationships with clients, you do a job, they're happy with what you did. You don't shortchange them or try and nickel and dime them or any of those kind of things. And you build up those relationships, and that's what will let it develop. Now, apart from that, young engineers wanting to develop into their own companies, perhaps, you know, we talked about the pathway, maybe. You've got to wait for the right time. You've got to, of course, do all the usual, a sort of like a business plan, and think about all the non-technical aspects of hiring people or marketing and um, uh, the brand and the website, and it goes on and on. So if you're developing a new company, of course, I mean, we give lectures on this. I do, and many others do. Think about all those different aspects of doing it, and I don't think just go on your gut feeling. And I think the biggest counter example is you see sometimes in your corner neighborhood, somebody decides to set up a coffee shop or whatever it is, and didn't think through who's the clientele, what's the, what's the profit margins, am I charging too much, am I charging too little, and then it goes bust in 6 months. So that's a coffee shop, but sort of those ideas apply equally to running a company. Charge out rates is important. I mean, you can't charge too low. In fact, you're forbidden to, according to the code of ethics, just for the sake of getting jobs. And you don't build your reputation that way. So you want to preserve that. The other hand, if it's not competitive, then you won't get the jobs either. So it's all those kind of factors that you've got to keep front and center in your mind if you're trying to develop a company.
Okay. Okay. And then moving on to academic stuff, is there anything you would say to first years who are currently going through an unprecedented change with online school, online first year instead of in person? Is there any advice you'd give to students in that situation?
I think certainly my experiences as a professor, as a teacher, has been pretty positive. It's not the same as person to person, but it's a pretty good substitute. And so I think my advice is try and embrace it to the extent you can, and try not to focus on the negative. And I mean, I shouldn't say make excuses, but complain and this is not working and that's not working and so on and so forth. But just use this as a learning experience and look at the positive opportunities that come from this. For instance, efficiencies are way higher, as one example. And just, it's your mindset, I think. So as one example of that, I don't know, different courses do it different ways, but now we have these so-called proctoral exams. Have you done one of those?
Yeah, I've done one.
Oh, you've done one. Okay. So, it's very intimidating to hear about this and to see all the rules. But just follow the basics. You've got to have a webcam, or you've got to try out your laptop correctly. So do the preparatory work that's needed, and it should be fine. So I guess I'm trying to say be positive, and there are some benefits to it. I mean, there's also the challenges, of course, right? Mainly the person to person, especially with lab work and all the rest of it. But nevertheless, I think try and hopefully keep as positive a outlook as you can.
Okay. Those are some encouraging words of advice. So we're coming up to the end here. We're almost out of time. So I have just one more question for you. In getting high position roles, such as being the Dean of Applied Science or being on the Senate of UBC Vancouver, or even the President of EGBC, you've touched on professionalism and you've touched on just learning from your mistakes and everything, but what would you attribute getting those roles to, or let me better phrase this, like what would you say was the best attribute you had that allowed you to get into those positions?
Yeah, and I think there's another attribute that I haven't mentioned that I think has been central to that, and that is to have a broad viewpoint. Sometimes when I talk to the Iron Ring obligants, I talk about remember the big picture, and I mean that, and combined with a diversity of interests and activities. So for instance, in the university setting, I was very involved with UBC Okanagan and setting it up, and of course setting up the School of Engineering. But one of the things that interested me about being the dean was interactions across all the disciplines, electrical and mining, and an interest in all the disciplines. So the breadth of interests is pretty critical. and not just on the academic side, but also in the university political life, on senates, whether it was the budget committee. I was chair of the academic building needs committee or appeals committee. So again, a breadth of interests in that particular context. So I think that breadth and that diversity of interests is pretty useful ingredient to bring to those kinds of positions.
Awesome. Well, thank you for coming for this interview. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day, and I'm sure all the students that watch this will too.
Okay, well, thank you for having me again, and we'll see how that goes.